Good morning, everybody. So I'm so pleased to actually be standing here in person and with people in the digital Zoom space today to welcome you all to this talk on behalf of the National Urban Indigenous Coalitions Council and the Indigenous Knowledge Mobilization Hub. It feels very weird to be present with people with having done this so many times virtually now. And I'm definitely remembering our introductory round back at our other location. And I'm just so pleased and honored to have done this work alongside of you for so long, because the work that NUICC is doing is so important for communities across the country and communities where all of you are from. So thank you so much for the work that you do. I'm also reminded of Charlene, talking about adjusting to how it is that we come into Indigenous spaces and how it's safe to be ourselves in these spaces. So thank you so much for creating that environment as well. It's such a treat. And I'm so glad today to welcome Kanatase and Matthew, who are doing a lot of heavy lifting work on how it is that we integrate UNDRIP and ideas of Indigenous sovereignty into urban Indigenous spaces, into urban spaces. Thinking back again to when we did our round of introductions, there are many of us here who are trying to navigate who we are as Indigenous people, and again, how we navigate ourselves as Indigenous people on land that isn't necessarily our own. So I'm really grateful today to welcome you both. I'm going to let both of you introduce yourselves in ways that feel appropriate to you, because I always feel that reading bios just doesn't ever do justice to the way that we introduce ourselves by our own protocols and in our own voices. So yeah, thank you so much. And I will turn the floor over to you.
All right, yeah, I'll go. So Sago, everybody, Sago again. So today I am going to be talking a little bit about my thinking about urban Indigenous governance. This feels a little awkward. I'm used to lecturing and stuff like this. I don't want to approach this like a lecture, but it does feel a little natural for me, so I'll give you that. Yeah, Erwin had introduced me or reached out to me, like I said, a couple of weeks ago to kind of help out and coordinate with NUICC, and so it's my pleasure to be part of this organization and to also develop some very important thinking around these issues of urban Indigenous experiences and urban Indigenous governance. As my background has to do with thinking through Indigenous law, so our traditional legal systems. Ruben had talked about that, right, in his opening words with us about the importance and significance of Indigenous laws and legal orders. And so my thinking as a emerging academic is about what that looks like in urban centers, like what that looks like in cities. And so I think there's a lot of overlap between my own work and what NUICC is doing and what it can do in the future. More specifically, I think what I can do is highlight not only what the future might look like, but what has been happening so far over the past couple of decades in Canada with regards to urban Indigenous kinship practices. Kinship follows us. It doesn't stay on the reserve, it doesn't say stay in the north with us, or if we come from the north. And I really want to emphasize this. I want to take us through some stories of what that has looked like and how we can build upon that when thinking about urban Indigenous governance. But before I even begin there, I want to say Nyamagoa to the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish nations for having me here on their lands. I always feel it's important to recognize the sovereignty of Indigenous nations wherever I go and wherever I'm living. I myself come from Ottawa, the unceded lands of the Anishinaabe peoples, whose lands Ottawa is built upon, Parliament's built on traditional lands of the Anishinaabe peoples. I've come to hear that Parliament is built from the bones of the Anishinaabe peoples. Like they made a lot of those stones from the gravel in the local area, and a lot of the bones were actually used or crushed up and put into Parliament. So, these are very tragic histories of these lands, but also there's a lot of vibrance. We can't just focus on the negatives that have taken place in the city. We also need to think about what we're actually doing when we come to these spaces. So the title of my talk is Building Upon the Work of Our Ancestors, Kinship Practices in Urban Spaces. So here's an overview of what I plan on talking about today. I'm going to situate myself a little bit better, provide a little bit more background information about myself, so you can vet me, I guess, if you want. And then I'm going to ground a lot of my talk, I think, in Mohawk experiences with mobility and kinship, because like all Indigenous peoples, we were all over the place. We weren't just in one spot. And so I want to talk a little bit about that history, and not just like the history of moving around, because there's more to it than that. There's histories of kinship that take place. And I want to talk a little bit about what, Mohawk political thought around that. After that, I want to talk about where we can see urban Indigenous kinship in countries across Canada, and even in America as well, right? Because the United States has its own experiences. But in Canada, we see kinship in friendship centers, in my opinion. And not only in the development and establishment of friendship centers, but also in the very work that Indigenous people do in those spaces. And I like to ground or argue it's kinship, but it's actually Indigenous law that folks are doing in Indigenous spaces, in those friendship center spaces. And so I want to talk a little bit about that and my thinking. And then finally, kind of round it out towards what NUICC is doing and UNDRIP, and then also, how NUICC can advocate for these things in its politics. So that's where I'm talking about building upon the work of our ancestors. If you have any questions at any point, I'm more than welcome to hearing questions. If you want something explained a little bit better, if I didn't explain myself more clearly, I'm more than willing to hear from you. Okay, so I'm Mohawk from Kahnawake. Very similar history and geography, I would argue, to Vancouver. It's a very urbanized environment. You can see here, Kahnawake is right on the south shore of Montreal. So Montreal's on an island, of course, the island of Montreal, and Kahnawake is right on the south shore. It's a community. There's a very long history going back to the 1600s of Mohawks and the French having a relationship, if you will, sometimes friendly, sometimes violent, but there's a relationship there. And Kahnawake, for a very long time, was present on these lands, but then there's a history of those lands being dwindled, very similar to what took place here in Vancouver. So that's where my father's from, and he grew up there, but also in other places across kind of northeastern North America, because of the history of our people. My mother's from Kanatase, which is where the infamous Oak Crisis took place, and that's about 45 minutes northwest of Kahnawake. Kahnawake, the south shore, is connected to the island of Montreal through the Mercier Bridge. There's a history there of land dispossession to develop that bridge that went right through Kahnawake to connect the south shore to the island of Montreal. So I'm a PhD candidate at Carleton University. I'm also an instructor at Carleton and the University of Ottawa. I do research on Indigenous law in the city, like I said, where I'm trying to shine a light on the work that urban Indigenous people are doing, particularly in friendship centers. So I'm doing work with the Odawa Native Friendship Center, which is the local friendship center in Ottawa. And what I'm seeing there is such amazing work that dedicated staff are involved in. And I want to round out my conversation about my relationship with NUICC. I want to contribute, like I said earlier, to the work that NUICC is doing. And if I can offer insights where I can, I'd be happy to do that. And hopefully this presentation gives you a better insight about what I can contribute, my thinking about these things, and hopefully you find them useful. So the Haudenosaunee Mohawk political thought around kinship and mobility. Just a little bit of background on who the Mohawk and who the Haudenosaunee are. The Haudenosaunee are made up of 5 nations, but now 6 nations who are individual nations. So you have the Mohawk, the Seneca, the Onondaga, Cayuga, Tuscarora, and Oneida. So those are 6 independent nations, but they come together under one longhouse. And together they're known as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And they're represented at the national level, at the federal level, if you will, by 50 chiefs. So there's, from those 6 nations, there are 50 chiefs that meet, historically used to meet in Onondaga. And each nation had, chiefs that represented them politically at this federal level. Because I want to talk about the makeup of our political structures, of our governance structures, because there's such an important tie between this political structure and kinship and our kinship practices. Because the Haudenosaunee were non-hierarchical people. We didn't have hierarchies of top-down models where you had a king, for example, or a prime minister telling people what to do. You didn't have court systems. You didn't have police or jails. You didn't have any of that. Instead, what you had is these widespread kinship networks. And I feel like we still continue those practices in the way we introduce ourselves, right? Like who's your father, who's your mother, so-and-so. It's a way of locating yourself in this elaborate, complex web of kinship relationships. And when we think about it, that is actually our political infrastructure, is those kinship networks, because that is what sustains our communities, is knowing your role in these kinship networks, is knowing your place in these kinship networks, understanding who you have responsibilities towards, who you have relationships with, what kind of relationships you have. And so kinship was a super important structure. It was a necessity in our lives as Haudenosaunee. At the same time, you were an individual. You had rights. You certainly had an identity. And what's important, though, is that identity was grounded in these intricate, complex kinship networks. And why this is so significant is because I'm a legal scholar, so to speak. I really pay attention to when we talk about law. And so Haudenosaunee or Mohawk understandings of law was grounded in this intricate web of kinship networks. And so the Haudenosaunee or Mohawk word for law, so I've been told by my family, is Gayanaratsara, which translates to acting in a peaceful manner. So you can see how there's this emphasis placed on you as an individual acting in a certain way in relation to everything around you, your family, your extended kin, future generations, ancestors, to the land. It's everything you're connected to. And you have to act in a certain way, in a lawful way, in order to be considered a good person. Ruben talked about that. That is our role on these lands as a human being, is to be a good relation. To be a good relation is to be a lawful person, is to be acting according to the legal systems of your people. And so Haudenosaunee were people of the law, right? We had these laws, we had these legal systems. We had the Great Law of Peace, which is the overarching constitution of our people. So the Great Law of Peace in Mohawk is the Gayanaragoa, which is the Great Law of Peace. And kinship mediated all of that. Kinship was the connecting tissue that made it all work. And I feel like we still continue these practices today. We haven't really lost them. Colonialism, for all of it did to our communities, it never really fully extinguished these systems of understanding of who we are as people. And they're still alive. And that's what my research, that's what I try to do in my research, is to highlight how we still practice kinship in our lives. At the same time, kinship was not connected to, you living in a certain spot. It followed you. So that's why mobility is such an important concept or thing to keep in consideration when talking about kinship. Is because you had kin, you had responsibilities wherever you went, and they followed you. It's such an important thing to keep in mind. I was reading something, and it's this guy, he's talking about the history of the Great Law of Peace, and he uses the imagery of string cheese, like it stretches, right? And he talks about maybe that's a useful way to think about kinship, is that it stretches no matter how far you go from your home community. And that's such an important idea to think about, right? When thinking about how we as urban Indigenous peoples move so far away from our communities, yet we're intricately connected to our home communities, to our families, to our clans, and so forth. So what does this look like in practice? What does this look like on the ground in more contemporary contexts? The Haudenosaunee on the go, the histories of mobility of my people. Even prior to like the establishment of like these very permanent communities, Mohawks, Haudenosaunee were always mobile. They had these histories of communities moving every couple of decades in a very circular fashion. The Haudenosaunee were agricultural people, so they planted, they were farmers, and when the soil was depleted, they would often move the community. But beyond just the mobility of our communities, the people themselves would often always go out. They would always leave the community, whether that was to trade, whether that was through warfare, military. The Mohawks went to the Wendat nation a very long time ago, had a relationship, I will say, with the Wendat people. And we practiced diplomacy. We also traveled for ceremonial purposes as well. So we were very mobile, and that is part of our history as the Haudenosaunee. We traveled all over North America. Even in more contemporary times, the Haudenosaunee even went as far as Edmonton. There's a Mohawk community there, who's known as the Michelle Band. Some Mohawks through the fur trade went all the way west to present day Edmonton, although they were enfranchised in the 1950s. So that band does not exist anymore, but it just demonstrates how Mohawkness followed those people. They always thought of themselves as Mohawk when they went wherever they went. They carried those responsibilities with them wherever they went to. In the late 1800s, the early 1900s, the Mohawks transitioned. As a period of transition. At that time, at least in Kahnawake, the river system, the St. Lawrence River, the surrounding lands were heavily polluted because of Montreal's development as a city, right? It was at that time the largest city in Canada, and it was just a booming city, and it completely destroyed the landscape, the water systems. And so the Mohawk men had to leave the community, and they continued to think of themselves as Mohawk as they left. This is where you see the emergence of Mohawk ironworking. I don't know if many of you are familiar, but the Mohawks are known for being ironworkers. New York City, Chicago, all the big cities in northeastern, especially in the United States. My own father, my own grandfather were ironworkers. This is a picture of a Kahnawake ironworker in New York City, probably in the 1950s or 60s, which is when there was this heavy shift in in the culture, the social relationships of our community. Wherever they went, wherever Mohawks went, sometimes they would go and they would come back on the weekends. My father has that history of, he went to New York City Monday to Friday, and then him and his cousins or his friends, they would drive back to spend the weekend in Kahnawake. And that's a practice you still see in Kahnawake, where men do go to New York City to work during the week. But that is a physically exhausting practice. And so even in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, you had Mohawks establishing small communities wherever they went, where they could stay all year round. And so, you know, we went to Edmonton during the fur trade, but during the ironworking period, we actually went to, there continues to be a small Mohawk community in New York City, in Brooklyn. And all those Mohawks are from Kahnawake, Akwesasne, maybe even Six Nations as well. And those are vibrant Mohawk communities, and they still think of themselves as Mohawk. They don't like, oh, we're New Yorkers or anything like that. It's no, we're Mohawk. We know where we come from. We know who our families are, and and we know who we're connected to. And that's the history of my people, is thinking of themselves in this way, of traveling, being mobile people, yet intrinsically they never take that part away from themselves that they're Mohawk, simply because they live away from their communities. And so, you know, that's just a little bit about my people. You know, I was never an iron worker myself. The closest I came to that was when I was about 10 years ago. I was on a high ropes course, like when I was in like a summer camp. I was like a camp counselor, and there was a high ropes course, and there was like one wooden beam. You were all strapped in and everything. There was no way of you getting hurt. I just took one step on, and I got terrified. And I never even walked across, because I was like, this is not for me. But then I hear stories of my father who, you know, is walking across these high beams in New York City, and then even his own father and my uncles, you know, not tied on, as you, which is the lingo. You're not tied on to anything. You're just walking freely, and I could never do that. So I chose academia, if you will. Completely on the other end of the spectrum.
Which is a different kind of tightrope.
Yeah, it is a different kind of tightrope. So I'm going to make a shift here where I'm not talking so much about Mohawks, although, you know, Mohawks are part of this larger history in Canada. You've had Mohawks. I have relatives that were part of the establishment of friendship centers across Canada. But this is more about Indigenous experiences in relation to the development of friendship centers. I argue, like I said at the very outset, that I see this as law. I see this as enactments of very lawful behaviors, of things that we as Indigenous peoples fundamentally believe in, that we feel is the right thing to do, the necessary thing to do. And in my opinion, from a Haudenosaunee, from a Mohawk Indigenous perspective, that is all law. That is all law. And so to take a step back, we see Indigenous urbanization take place, at least with First Nations, in the 1950s. Although I know the Métis have their own unique experience with urbanization. You know, the history of Métis script, and also the Inuit have their own unique experience with urbanization, primarily through medical services and things of that nature. But when thinking about First Nations experiences, urbanization in Canada really picks up in the 1950s. And the reason for this is because there was a lot of reasons. One of the main things is there were amendments to the Indian Act. Prior to 1951, it was illegal to leave the reserve without the permission of the Indian agent, right? You need to, that's where you see those what should we call it? The pass system, right? You see the pass system. And that was a very real thing, that limited mobility. you couldn't leave unless you had permission. And so, but First Nations women had their own experiences through enfranchisement, losing their Indian status, no longer being able to live on the reserve. But if we speak in generalities, 1951 is a pivotal moment in urbanization because you're no longer trapped on the reserve, you can leave. Internally within the federal government, the federal government assumed that urbanization was the next path towards assimilation. So, within their internal conversations, within their internal documents, they assume that rubbing shoulders with Canadians, entering the market economy, being surrounded by English speaking or maybe French speaking Canadians, that it would just be natural that they're going to assimilate. They're going to lose their culture when they move to the city. And so urbanization in the 1950s is not this benevolent thing that Canada was gifting to Indigenous peoples. Rather, it has this very dark history, this dark insidious history behind it. That's one thing about urbanization. But from a First Nations or Indigenous understanding of things, they weren't going to do that. There was no desire to give up or to assimilate into mainstream society. In fact, you kind of see the opposite, right? The first friendship centers start to emerge in 1951, 1952, in Toronto, in Winnipeg, and I think in Saskatoon or Vancouver. But like right away, First Nations people, Métis as well, are developing friendship centers. They're developing these very strong, vibrant spaces for community members to gather, to meet. The federal governments and the provincial governments wanted friendship centers to be these places where just referrals, like refer people to, other social services in the province. But they also acted as spaces for people to gather, to practice their culture, to practice their language. And so there's a contradiction. The federal government expects one thing with urbanization. First Nations people, Indigenous peoples are doing something completely different. So that begs the question, like, what are we looking at when we see urbanization take place? Are we seeing the colonial government? Are we seeing Canada trying to govern Indigenous people in a way to pursue assimilation? Or are we seeing Indigenous law in action? Are we seeing kinship being practiced in cities? And I would argue we can see both. We can see the Canadian state, the provinces trying to do one thing, and then you see Indigenous people go into those spaces and transform them from, got dark in here.
Is it because we're not moving enough?
It's okay with darker lights.
There we go. Yeah, that was nice.
It was nice. Everybody stay still. So I would argue that we're seeing both things. We're seeing that the government tried to do things. We're trying to see the government trying to assimilate Indigenous peoples, at least at that time. But you're also seeing Indigenous peoples saying, no, that's not the path that we want to follow. We want to continue to be Indigenous peoples in these spaces. Mind you, it's all our land anyways, right? It's not like the reserve captures the extent of our territories. The cities are built on our land. And so you don't cease to be Indigenous when you leave the reserve. You continue to be Indigenous, continue to be Mohawk, wherever you go. And so building communities, building urban Indigenous communities, in my opinion, is, I'm very proud of this history of our people. And just the fact that kind of the spaces that they transformed, they tend to transform like old schools, churches. And so there's a lot of unique things taking place through friendship centers. And I realize that there are other organizations besides friendship centers in cities across Canada. Ottawa has its own unique placement, or there's a lot of different organizations in Ottawa, but friendships in particular are these very unique spaces, and they do very important work. On the airplane here, I was reading something, and it's a quote by Sylvia Miracle, who was she might be, or don't they, I should say they might be the continuing executive director of OFIFC, where Sylvia Miracle understands her role as carrying the bones of the people, which is where Sylvia went on to explain that this is the hard work of governance, this is the hard work of leadership, this is the hard work of enacting our laws, our traditions in urban spaces, so that community members who live in these spaces feel at home, can continue to practice their traditions and build community, but in line with their own laws, right? Laws follow us no matter where we go. They continue to be enacted in our daily conversations and the way we interact with other people, especially other Indigenous peoples. And so in my own research, I am doing work with the local Friendship Center in Ottawa, and I work with members of the justice team who, there's the Indigenous court worker, bail supervisor, all sorts of different programs where these folks are working with urban Indigenous peoples. And these are programs that are largely created by federal and provincial programs or policies. And to a certain extent, the criminal code, the Canada's criminal code, is also has input into what the justice team members do. But what I'm seeing through the work that I'm doing with Odawa is actually something beyond that. They're not just enforcing programs. They're not just simply doing service delivery. They are enacting Indigenous law in the work that they do. There's a deep sense of commitment to the community. There's a deep sense of having responsibilities to the community. There's a deep sense of having an obligation to ensure that the community is healthy, is vibrant, and dealing with conflict and disputes in a culturally sensitive way. Yeah.
I do have a question.
Yes, please do. Please ask. I'm tired of hearing my own voice.
So, no, it's okay. So, friendship centers, like the first ones in Canada in the 50s, yeah, it's right. It's urbanization from Indigenous people, but like at the beginning, it was women.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Women movement.
Yeah. And
they were out of the reserve because of several reasons. Because they were like having affairs with white guys and whatever.
Yeah.
So like the first reason the friendship centers were made at first, it was because women wanted to reconnect with their own identity.
Oh, absolutely.
So did you compare like the indigenous law with that movement? Because like friendship centers is like the reason why Indigenous law like force civil women to go out of the reserve.
Well, it's not. I completely agree with you. It was. Maybe I should have clarified that. I should have drew a spotlight on that. It was definitely Indigenous women, First Nations women who were enfranchised, right? Lost their Indian status. Were forced to leave their communities and in turn develop communities. Absolutely, it was First Nations women that were the main drivers of friendship centers. But it wasn't Indigenous law that was kicked them out. It was. I want to be very careful here. It was the Indian Act, right? It was the chiefs who were enforcing Canadian law, although they thought they were doing the right thing. They thought they were protecting their communities. In hindsight, absolutely a terrible history, atrocious history of patriarchy, coming into our communities, and masquerading as tradition. And that's just a history that still impacts and influences our communities to this day, no doubt about it. But it was arguably the Indian Act, right? You had the Indian Act, and in my community, Ganawage is potentially one of the worst communities that has a history of doing this to this day, of kicking people out who marry out, right? Is this being recorded? Yeah.
But I do have a second question.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've got
We
Matthew.
actually,
We've
we
got
have
Matthew.
Oh, yeah.
Matthew who's gonna be responding to.
So it says Matthew.
yeah.
Can you wrap up with it?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you save your questions to the end?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's an easy one.
Okay. So I just want to wrap up here and say that, like, I'm seeing in my work, I'm seeing Indigenous law, kinship, all these different things being practiced in communities. And this is such an important history and important ongoing development that we need to pay attention to on the ground in the communities. But even myself as part of, like, the academic community, there's not enough attention being placed on what's going on in cities. There's this tendency to think that urban Indigenous people are kind of assimilated. And it goes back to, like, what is an authentic Indian? What is an authentic Indigenous person? Oh, it's someone that lives in the woods or lives on the reserve. Anybody who moves to the city is no longer authentic. And that thinking still, contributes to how we think about urban Indigenous peoples. I'm here to say that that kind of thinking is very wrong. It doesn't match what is actually taking place in the city, where we're seeing there's a vibrancy. We're seeing Indigenous people taking care of themselves according to their traditions, according to their laws, and doing it in a way that enacts kinship, these kinship practices. Everything, I think, can be explained through kinship. Kinship is so important to understanding urban Indigenous experiences. All right. I want to talk about UNDRIP a little bit, but I realize we're kind of running out of time. But I want to pay attention to, basically, quick summary of UNDRIP is, adopted by the United Nations in 2007. It sets out international human rights standards for all Indigenous peoples all over the world. It wasn't the UN necessarily creating it. A lot of Indigenous input went into the construction and development and like the establishment of UNDRIP, and all sorts of different rights and obligations are outlined in UNDRIP. Some of the most important ones being, the duty to consult, but more than the duty to consult, it's also FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, and the right to self-determination. Those are the things that I feel like urban Indigenous peoples don't really get to experience or get to enact in their politics. And I think NUICC has a really good chance to change those types of things, enter the conversation and be like, there are communities here, they have these rights too. And it's not just for reserves, it's not just for communities in the north. They're not just for communities that we tend to associate with where Indigenous people live. We live here in the city and it's our land as well. I'm gonna kind of skip this one because I'll just go over them quickly. These are the articles, in my opinion, that really explain or provide a lot of substance for urban Indigenous peoples. The right to self-determination, the right to participate in local decision-making, and the right to be part of the conversations and decision-making when those things would affect their rights. So these are all things, Indigenous people exercise their rights in the city, and so therefore they should be part of those conversations where like, whether that's in city hall, at the provincial level, at the federal level, urban Indigenous people should be part of those conversations, and they should be sending their best people, or not their best people, that's the wrong way to put it. They should be having people selected people to participate in those higher level conversations. And that's where Indigenous governance, urban Indigenous governance comes into play. Building upon the work of our ancestors. So when thinking ahead, we need to keep in mind that Canada seems committed to including urban Indigenous peoples in the development of its national action plan, which is set to, well, it's in the process of going through that right now, but urban Indigenous people need to be at the table. And from my understanding, I think NAFC might be there, but there are other voices also need to be there that are advocating not just for friendship centers, but for actual governance in the city. And so organizations like NUICC, I think, are in a prime position to be doing that. Building upon existing infrastructure. In that yellow headpiece, which is the thing that brought me here in the first place, I talked about building upon existing infrastructure. I meant organize, offices that are already in City Hall, but I also was talking about building upon those kinship networks that are already in the city. We are already exercising governance in these small spaces. And so we need to build upon those things that are already there. It's not like we're starting from scratch. There are already very important things taking place in the city. And I think, NUICC should be advocating for this going forward. This is my last slide. On the ground, what this might look like, in my opinion, just based on kind of like my experiences in Ottawa, kind of seeing what things look like in policy development, is what you're probably going to see in the short term is local organizations, local institutions, kind of including UNDRIP language in their budgetary asks, like, hey, we have the right to do this. And it says that in UNDRIP, well, we need some more money. You're going to see that, obviously. I even remember doing that at AFN, including UNDRIP provisions in some of my my work, to like writing letters to the government, for example. And you're going to see more of that, I think, especially with Canada being committed to adopting UNDRIP. And you're also going to see more local political maneuvering between institutions. But in the short term, in the longer term, larger political goals and what things I maybe NUICC can advocate for is for increased representation in political systems, whether that's City Hall or something else that has some sort of decision-making power, and grounding these developments in UNDRIP. And I think that's what we're going to see in the long term. And I think NUICC is in a good position to be advocating for those sorts of things. But I want to pay very careful attention to do this in ways that are in relationship with local Indigenous communities. So not over asserting itself, but doing it in a collaborative, respectful way that understands that we're on the traditional lands of Indigenous nations already. And so we need to do this in ways that respect Indigenous sovereignty. So, I'm only spitballing here. It's going to take a lot of hard work, a lot of conversations to really spell out what this looks like. But I just really want to emphasize that urban governance needs to be done in collaboration with local governments and local First Nations governments, local Indigenous governments. And likewise, they need to be willing to participate also and have that relationship as well, which I think is already taking place, if I'm not mistaken. And finally, I think that Indigenous law must be part of these conversations because it's already being practiced in the city. It's just a matter of recognizing it and looking at it. And so Indigenous law, Indigenous governance needs to move out of the shadows. It exists, but we're not paying attention to it. And we need to bring it to the bring it to the surface. It needs to guide our politics, and including future iterations of urban Indigenous governance. So that wraps up my presentation. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak, and I'm sure you'll have lots of questions afterwards, especially Jean-François.
But I grew up.
Can we just wait for Matthew? Because Matthew's online right now.
Okay.
We were supposed to do the parking spot
Yeah, we can,
for this as well.
if you write a note or text it to yourself, we would love to come back it after. It's just Matthew is got only a limited window for being able to.
So we were gonna use the parking spot where if you have questions or comments to put it in a note and then we'll talk about all of them.
Yeah, I don't think I can type that.
Oh.
That's okay, just remember it.
Yeah.
Is there an opportunity, because I think, we have an opportunity to actually engage, with our presenter here now,
Yeah.
rather than having an opportunity.
Yeah, no, we are. It's just, Matthew is here for just like 10 or 15 minutes to respond, and then we're immediately going to have questions afterwards.
I'm just saying, this
Hopefully
will
we're-
not have space for us to.
Oh, yeah,
have
definitely.
questions.
Yeah, all right. Thank you for being here, Matthew. So yeah, we have Matthew for such a limited time today. But then we're immediately going to be able to ask questions and talk through some of the things that have been presented so far, but we'll also include some of the things that Matthew is sharing. So Matthew, if you would like to take it away.
Yeah, great. So am I correct in understanding we've got about 10, 15 minutes or so? I'd love to be able to have questions. So that's great. Sorry I can't be there in person. I would prefer to be there in person to know who's in the room. But I'm in multiple meetings at once right now. So I'm trying to juggle things. Tanse, Matthew Norris, Nisitiko-san, Lactarange, Otsunita. Hello, everyone. Oh dear, that's me. Yeah, hello. So I'm Woodlands Cree from Treaty 6, Lactarange First Nation, Northern Saskatchewan, though I live and work on the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I'm the president of the Urban Native Youth Association in Vancouver, which is a large established urban Indigenous organization. And I've got about 8 years of experience working on UNDRIP implementations. So previously I was the policy analyst with the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and the First Nations Leadership Council in BC, working on the DRIPA Act as well as the federal acts 262 and C15. And then more recently, I'm a policy and communication specialist with a Vancouver City Councillor, and was on the drafting team for the city motion to implement UNDRIP. And I'm also a PhD candidate at UBC in international relations focused on UNDRIP implementation, and particularly how municipalities, local governments, and First Nations actors, or Indigenous actors rather, kind of can coalesce around what UNDRIP means at the local level. I have been looking forward to this conversation. Kanatase and I've never met. I got sent your Yellowhead article by Hayden a couple of months ago after I did an event with them. So I've been really looking forward to having the chance to kind of speak and to engage on this work. It's a big question right now. What role do urban Indigenous communities have in the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People? There's no kind of clear answer right now. So I would like to kind of dig into that a little bit, especially around what we've started seeing within the City of Vancouver's implementation plan. Urban Indigenous people kind of occupy a very kind of unique space that the kind of current federal and provincial and municipal kind of consultation and engagement frameworks that are certainly out of date and ineffectual have focused primarily on dealing with Indigenous communities and largely band council governments. It has left a lot of the kind of issues in the context that urban Indigenous peoples are facing off the table. It's resulted in kind of poorly defined and ineffective policies, budget lines, legislation. And you're seeing urban Indigenous peoples are facing in particular contexts. And I'm speaking particularly to Vancouver, but we see the urban Indigenous population being disproportionately impacted by homelessness, by housing affordability, by poison drug supply, by policing, by the inaccessibility of kind of culturally relevant programming and education. And there's a growing feeling that our communities are being kind of left out of the discussions that are taking place. And so a lot of my research, I went back to do my PhD about 3 or 4 years ago, kind of answering, okay, well, what's the potential that UNDRIP poses for urban Indigenous communities? Urban Indigenous communities have been primarily left out of a lot of the UNDRIP kind of implementation discussions at the federal and provincial level. And it's due, and it's interesting. So when you look at UNDRIP, the definition for Indigenous peoples, who are Indigenous peoples and who can claim the rights for Indigenous peoples, is left intentionally vague. And that was on purpose. That was largely the result of, oh boy, that's an effect. It's been left intentionally vague by the Indigenous drafters of the Declaration so that states can use a more rigid definition to marginalize Indigenous peoples from claiming their rights. So that was intentional. What's kind of commonly understood within academic circles and within the international legal circles is that the UN Declaration the rights and articles of the UN Declaration can kind of be divided into 2 categories of rights. One is cultural and social rights. So those are the rights to health, education, to training, to languages, to traditions, to medicine, to practices, and being able to pass on those knowledge. But then the second category of rights that the UNDRIP deals with is kind of land-based rights. And so generally what's understood is that these land-based rights are what generates like rights to resources, rights to environmental protections, but also rights to title and self-determination. And I've got a woodpecker on my roof that's just hammering. It's a little distracting, but and legal systems that those have like very rooted systems based in our communities' relationships to the land and to the environment and our traditional territories that colonialism has, purposefully interrupted and tried to destroy. And so that puts us in a strange situation when it comes down to what role the urban Indigenous people have within these rights-based systems, because a lot of urban programming, a lot of mandates within municipal jurisdictions has direct implications on urban Indigenous people's quality of life, on the way that we enjoy our rights and the way that our voices are represented. So you have policing mandates, you have school boards, you have access to urban outdoor space, you have housing policy, health policy. There's a lot of very relevant policy areas that fall within city governments that urban Indigenous peoples have a right to. But the recognition of Indigenous people's rights, urban Indigenous people's rights, need to be mindful that a lot of these urban spaces are on the lands of Indigenous folks. Vancouver, for instance, is home to the territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And so there's a kind of a really tricky balance there between claiming a right to self-determination and a right to processes of land determination and whatnot, without undermining the rights and title of the host nations. So I've been inclined to approach this work as a guest on the territories of the host nations in Vancouver. There's also, and I think one area that I disagree with our keynote speaker is that political representation of urban Indigenous peoples is one avenue, one result. And it may be the result that works best, but the result needs to be arrived at in complete discussion, and credit where credit's due that was brought up. That kind of result needs to be done in conversation with host nations. Urban Indigenous people and different communities have a different relationship with their urban communities. So there are some nations, and it's also a direct result of colonialism. So you have some communities that have such limited capacity and resources that they don't provide supports for programming to their urban communities, and that they don't have representation, and urban communities aren't able to vote in their community elections and so forth. You have other communities that are kind of in between the two ends of the discussion. And then you have communities like the Grand Council of the Crees, who have, my understanding is that they have an urban Indigenous department within their community that provides servicing, programming, and engagement with their urban members. So there's quite a range of circumstances that urban Indigenous peoples are kind of introduced to. And I think we have to be mindful of that when we're starting to develop processes for recognizing the rights of urban Indigenous peoples. And so kind of coming back to the Vancouver City Council motion, this was a huge question. How do we incorporate urban Indigenous voices, interests, and values while not undermining the title and rights of the host nations? Where I've kind of landed in my research and my kind of political work is there hasn't even been an opportunity to bring host nations and urban Indigenous communities together to discuss how we want our relationship to look like. We all know urban Indigenous communities and host nations are kind of underfunded, under-resourced, under capacity. And so our big kind of policy push is we need the government, municipal governments, federal governments, provincial governments to fund the engagement between urban Indigenous communities and local communities, to kind of have this discussion about how do we want to relate to each other? What are the relationships that we need to build? What are the legal systems that we need to construct in order to have all the voices represented at the table, and not to undermine each other's fight to get our rights recognized? And that is a big discussion. And there's kind of three kind of potential outcomes to that I've been witness to. One is host nations could take on the kind of rights and responsibilities for being accountable to the urban Indigenous community. That's an option. The second option is that municipalities maintain those kind of rights and responsibilities. And then that would require increased representation by urban Indigenous folks to have their voices recognized. You could have the creation of urban Indigenous governance structures, but all of these options need to be done in collaboration with host nations, and it needs to be an agreement. I mean, this is the point where we've arrived at, is that colonialism has kind of undermined our kinship structures that have existed. It has created new communities. The urban Indigenous communities is a direct result of colonialism. We've been removed from our communities, either residential schools, or 60 scoop, or imposed systems of poverty, trying to find careers, jobs, or education, and it's created a community, and a community that has rights, but rights that are distinctive than the kind of title and self-determination rights that we're seeing within host nations. So it's a conversation that needs to happen. It's a conversation that hasn't happened. And it's a conversation that needs to be resourced and given the adequate capacity to happen. And it's going to be a long road. And my research hasn't come across any case studies of this happening to the degree that we need to see, that UNDRIP is called for. I recognize we're probably running out of time, so maybe I can leave it there. And
I think, are you muted?
Questions?
No.
No? Can you hear me?
Yeah. There you go.
Okay, you're back.
Okay.
You're back.
Yeah.
Oh,
sorry.
wow.
I moved.
Sorry.
Canada, you're getting too close.
Jean-Francois, can you push the button
Yeah.
again that did it earlier? He's way brighter than it
Thank
was.
you, sir.
No problem.
Okay, carry on. Sorry about that.
All right. So where did I cut out? What happened?
Last sentence.
To the
Uh,
degree.
Yeah. So the last sentence is maybe I can leave it there for questions. The main kind of takeaways, this is a huge problem. It's hyper complex, and it needs to be done in a reciprocal relationship with host nations within municipal centers. And those discussions need to be resourced, they need to have adequate capacity, but they, most importantly, they need to be done together. I think one thing that we've seen within UNDRIP implementation in different spheres is that, and it was brought up early in this conversation, and I appreciate that, is these conversations between Indigenous folks can be used against us when there's kind of disagreements within our community. If there are people in government or in positions of power that are opposed to us achieving our rights, they'll use these divisions to undermine the whole rights-based process. And so that's kind of the risk, is that if we don't come together and we don't have these discussions with host communities, it could be used as an opportunity to stall the progress of Indigenous rights across Canada. And so that's kind of what I hope we can kind of come to an agreement to halt, by kind of having these collaborative process and these discussions with host nations to try and come together on an agreed form of participation and work together. But yeah, maybe I'll leave it as that.